What's happening everyone, my name is Alex and welcome back. In today's video we are checking out another affordable action camera from Apeman called the A100. The maximum recording resolution for this action camera is 4K at 50 frames per second, and the camera also supports image stabilization at all resolutions. So it doesn't matter if you're recording in 720p, 1080p or 4K, there is image stabilization available at all those resolutions. And later on in the video I'm also going to show you some sample recordings so you can see how that image stabilization works. First things first, we're gonna start a very quick unboxing. So the camera comes in a decent looking box. On the front of the box we see a picture of the camera, and on the back we can see some of the specs and features. Inside the box we are gonna find the camera itself and the waterproof case. The waterproof case is supposedly good to up to 40 meters in the water. However, I haven't been diving with it, so I can't really confirm if that's true or not. There is also a user manual in there that has a bunch of information in it, and if this is your first action camera, it may be worth reading that. And you're also going to find two batteries for the camera. On each battery you can get about 40 minutes if you're recording in 4K, or about an hour of recording time if you're recording in 1080p. As for charging the camera, that's done through a micro USB charging port on the side, and it takes about an hour and 20 minutes to fully charge this from 0 to 100. You're also going to find a remote control in there, so you can start and stop recordings from that remote control. You can take pictures, all that without actually having to touch the camera. And aside from that, we have a bunch of mounts and stickers, so you have the potential of placing the camera anywhere. Now, because at the bottom of the camera there is no quarter-inch screw hole, there is a little plastic case that you can put around the camera, and this way you can mount the camera on a tripod. Ideally, we would have had like a quarter-inch screw hole at the bottom, but since there isn't, you're gonna have to use that little plastic case. The camera itself is mostly made out of plastic except for the glass covering the lens here, and the camera looks pretty much like most action cameras that we've been seeing over the past 5 years, I'm gonna say. Now, if you look at this one and a GoPro, for example, this one doesn't feel as premium, but let's keep in mind that the GoPro is much more expensive as well. So the top here we have a couple of buttons. We have two more buttons on the right hand side, and on the left hand side we have a little plastic flap that covers the micro USB charging port, the HDMI port and the slot for the SD card. According to the user manual, this camera can take SD cards up to 64 gigs, and that's the only SD card I actually tried with it. And there is no mention of an external microphone, so I can't really confirm if an external microphone would actually work with this one. I believe that it's not, so keep that in mind. You're gonna have to rely on the internal microphone. And talking about the internal microphone, I think I should show you a couple of sample recordings so you can see how the internal microphone sounds. So let's check those out and I will be right back. Alright, this is our first audio test to the Apeman A100 action camera. So for this recording I am inside the car and all the windows are closed. So there shouldn't be any wind, you should only hear my voice. For this recording I'm also doing 4K at 30 frames per second. So this is how the internal microphone on the Apeman A100 sounds in these conditions. Alright, so for our next audio recording, I am outside and I'm recording in 4K at 30 frames per second. Of course, I have the image stabilization turned on, but this time around you're probably gonna hear a bit more noise aside from my voice. It is a bit windy and there is some traffic to my right. So this is how the internal microphone on this action camera would sound like if you're holding the camera in your hand and recording outside, basically. And as you've heard for yourself, the internal microphone is pretty average, but honestly I was kind of expecting that. I don't think I've had any Apeman camera that had a great internal microphone. Alright, going back to our camera, at the bottom here we have another plastic door that covers the battery, and on the back of the camera we have a 2-inch touch screen. Unfortunately, you cannot change the brightness of the screen, so what you're seeing now, that's the maximum and the only brightness available for this screen. And I guess you can kind of see it if it's not that bright outside. When I was filming this video it was pretty dark out, kind of gray, no sunshine, so you can barely see it under those conditions. So I'm assuming that if it would be super sunny it would become a bit more difficult to see. Alright, and next we're going to check out some sample recordings so you can see how that image stabilization works. So I have some 4K sample recordings and some 1080p sample recordings. So let's check those out and I will be right back. And I also want to show you how the image stabilization works while running. So for this recording, I'm doing 4K at 30 frames per second, and I have the image stabilization turned on. So we'll go this way. I'm also holding the camera in my hand, so I'm keeping it as steady as possible. We're gonna go up these stairs and down the stairs. And that's it, 4K 30 frames per second while running. And I also wanted to show you how the image stabilization would work if you're recording in 1080p at 60 frames per second. So you get the same image stabilization for 4K at 30 frames per second, and of course 1080p at 60 frames per second. And as you've seen for yourself, the image stabilization works okay when you are walking, but as soon as you start running or doing some more sudden movements, the image stabilization isn't that great. Once again, I was kind of expecting this, considering that this camera is kind of affordable. So next I want to show you a few more sample recordings that I've done during the day and at night, so you can see how the image looks in more situations, of course, and at different resolutions. So I'm gonna let you guys watch those recordings and I'll come back so we can talk about them. Next we have a quick recording in 1080p at 30 frames per second. Once again, at this resolution we have image stabilization available, and I have that enabled for this particular recording. So I'm just gonna walk up here. We're gonna stop here, we're gonna pan right slowly. Right and up basically, and then back left all around. So yeah, this is how recording in 1080p at 30 frames per second would look like from the Apeman A100. We are moving on to another 4K at 30 frames per second recording with the Apeman A100. Once again, at this resolution we have image stabilization, but we actually have image stabilization for pretty much all resolutions available on this camera. So it doesn't matter what resolution you're using, you have image stabilization available. So I just wanted to show you how a 4K at 30 frames per second recording would look like on a pretty gray and depressing looking day. For our next recording, I am inside the car and recording in 4K at 30 frames per second with the Apeman A100. For this recording, once again, we do have image stabilization, and I have the image stabilization enabled. So yeah, this is how a recording inside the vehicle would look like on a pretty gray day, I'm gonna say. And for one of our last daytime recordings, the Apeman A100, I'm doing 4K at 60 frames per second, where once again the image stabilization is turned on. So we're just gonna stop here, we'll pan left slowly and up a bit, and then back right. We'll keep walking for a bit. We'll stop here once again and we'll pan right slowly. So yeah, this is how recording in 1080p at 60 frames per second would look like. Alright, we have a quick recording in low light with the Apeman A100. For this recording I'm doing 4K at 30 frames per second, and I also have the image stabilization turned on at this resolution. So I'm just gonna stop somewhere around here. We're gonna pan left and right for a bit, so I'll go left slowly first. So it gets a bit darker around there, but I can still see quite a lot on the screen here, much better than a lot of other action cameras that I've tried in the past. So yeah, 4K at 30 frames per second. Next I'm gonna find a darker spot and I'll record in 1080p at 30 frames per second. Alright, and for our second recording in low light with the Apeman A100, I'm recording in 1080p at 30 frames per second, but as you can probably see here, it is a bit darker, so I can't really see that much on the screen anymore. It was much better earlier when we had some more street lights. So I'm just gonna stop here, we'll pan left slowly, and back right. So this way, and I guess I'll walk this way for a bit. So yeah, this is how recording in 1080p at 30 frames per second with this action camera would look like. So as you've seen for yourself, there was no sunshine in any of those recordings. Unfortunately, we haven't had sunshine in about 2 weeks. It's winter here in Canada, so that's what we get, depressing looking footage. But I have to say that the 4K at 30 frames per second recordings do look pretty decent, mostly considering that it wasn't that bright out, we don't have any blue skies and so on. So the 4K recordings do look decent. I've noticed that if I record in 4K at 50 frames per second, those recordings are actually faked. It's just 4K at 30 frames per second upscale to 4K at 50 frames per second. So those recordings aren't actually usable. So if you do buy a camera like this, just recording 4K at 30 frames per second, don't even bother with 4K at 50 frames per second. So I would say that the footage that I got from it is decent enough for the price of the camera. I wouldn't actually record anything at night with it, or with any other action camera for that matter, because the nighttime recordings don't look that great. Another feature worth mentioning would be the Wi-Fi connectivity. So the camera makes a Wi-Fi network, the phone connects to that Wi-Fi network. Of course, you have to install an app on your phone. You're gonna find that app in the user manual, and then you can see what the camera sees right on your smartphone. You can change settings, and you can also download those recordings that you've done with the camera in the past. So that could be handy in some situations, but the Wi-Fi connection only works good up to like 5 meters away from the camera. After that, it tends to disconnect. So to quickly conclude this video, for the price, because we always have to take into consideration the price, this camera isn't bad. Mostly if you look at those 4K at 30 frames per second recordings, those look pretty good taking in consideration the price. Now, if you want something better, of course, you're gonna have to spend more money and get a better camera. But as I said, for the price, this isn't bad. We also have features like a time-lapse at the press of a button. So you just go in the time-lapse mode and the camera will do a time-lapse by itself. What you've just seen on the screen was a time-lapse that I've done with it the other day. So overall, for the price, this isn't bad, but if you're hoping to buy this camera to replace a GoPro, I don't think that's gonna happen, because obviously a GoPro will be better, has more features, etc. But as I said, for the price, this isn't bad. Alright, thank you for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.